Welcome everyone. Well, we're here with the topic of brain matters in business, and let me start by giving you a quote. This quote is several years old, but I will admit that it's probably even more relevant today than it was when I first saw it about 6 or 7 years ago. And this is done by Matsushita. He says, "Business we know is so complex and difficult, the survival of the firm so hazardous, in an environment increasingly unpredictable, competitive and fraught with danger, that its continued existence depends on the day-to-day mobilization of every ounce of intelligence. And all you have to do is listen to the news to discover how badly the world seems off, and ultimately how our corporations are struggling in this environment." But there's another aspect that's really important, and it has to do with an article that was in June's paper in the Calgary Herald. "Stupidity seems to be contagious, study finds." And we all know this on a visceral level, because we know how sometimes you get caught up in the moment and you wonder why afterwards you did things the way you did. And that's really what, in essence, our talk is about, is what are some of the things that we can do to be different about it. We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices wisely. This is done by the famous Harvard biology professor Edward O. Wilson. And ultimately, it isn't even about choices. It's about knowing how your choices are formed and how your beliefs and your core values affect those. And keep in mind that we're not just talking about individuals here, we're talking about companies themselves have mindsets and ways of thinking. We're in a situation now, is there anyone here who doesn't know what Prozac is? Well, just in case, Prozac was invented in the early 1990s as an anti-anxiety and anti-depression drug. It was the first of many that was to come after. And the tragedy about this is that it's been estimated that more than 33 million North Americans have been on it or its derivatives at one time or other. And it's also been said that $3 billion a year is being paid by corporations in employee plans. And it tells you something about the stress level in our organizations. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to talk about leverage. That is to say, where can you put a little bit of bang and get a lot of buck out of it? Just like this particular character is just using a small amount, we're going to look at some of the little tipping point factors that could be involved. And one of the things that you have to know is that we may be in the information age, but our brains are still in the Stone Age. We are really still no different than hunter-gatherers when it comes down to it. And unfortunately, with all the changes that are happening with us, we've still evolved relatively slowly. And one of the things is that our brains still have the same structure and function as someone that was a hunter-gatherer millions of years ago. And we have genetic programming. Now, keep in mind, genetic programming is not just something that kicks in when you're born. It kicks in literally all throughout your life. And so there are certain times of our lives where your genes actually have a huge role to play. And ultimately, if you're not aware of that, you could also not have your potential realized. So whether you carry genes for disease or being susceptible to genes, these are always at play. And finally, there's what we call our environmental response. And that is to say, ultimately, we don't like people that are very different from us. And so even though we try and we say that we're accepting, our first response when somebody is seen is we already make a judgment. So when you first saw me, within the first 5 seconds, you already determined certain things about me. The first thing you looked at was, first of all, what race am I? Am I the same as you or not? Secondly, what gender am I? Are we the same gender? And finally, how old am I? Am I older or younger than you? Now keep in mind, you can't change those except for 2 of them, which can be very, very expensive. So within the first 5 seconds, you've already made a judgment, and here's the scary part. It turns out that in 90 seconds, you've already made a perception of that person, and that impression stays with you when you work with that individual only 2 out of 3 times. Over 60% of the time, you will keep that same impression and you will modify all the information coming in to fit it. So, what is it about brain structure that's so important? Well, your brain literally looks like this, a walnut. And it's basically like 2 halves of a walnut. And ultimately, if I actually open these up where my fingertips are, is a different part of the brain. And it turns out that even though they look on the outside the same, both sides are different, and the part where my fingertips are is called the limbic or emotional side, and they're different too. So one way of looking at this is E.O. Wilson's model, and he calls it this way. So sitting underneath this walnut, which is your brain, you have what's called primitive reptilian structure, and above it you have the actual walnut. And you can think of it this way. The primitive reptilian structure is really where you have heartbeat, right? It's where you have no control. It's where your breathing is, all the functions that keep your life going. And you know people that are at work like this too, eh? They don't do a lot of thinking, they just happen to be there. All right, above that is the limbic or the heartstrings. And then, as E.O. Wilson puts it so well, there's the heartless part up here, which is the cortex or the higher thinking power, right? Now, ultimately, what most people are maybe aware of now, but they were not until John Gray came on the scene, is that the brains of men and women are structured differently. They process information in very unique and different ways, and as a result, you have different perceptions, priorities, and behaviors. Now, the biology is simple. It's very clear that men and women are different when you look at them, right? Our brain has basically 2 sides, and on each side, it is asymmetric. That is to say, you actually have different functions in one side as opposed to the other. And for the left brain, they have certain skills like the verbal and linguistic, and the right brain has the visual, the spatial, and the holistic. And it turns out, for men and women, there are differences in these 2 sides. For women actually have their functions spread out over both hemispheres. Men tend to have their functions spread into one or the other, and generally only in one spot. And so one of the characteristics that we know of is that women will usually, after a stroke, recover more quickly because they have an area where the function can be taken over and redone, so to speak. So we have very deep consequences. One of the things is that the different brain layouts really account for the fact that men and women think very differently, and that ultimately you have what's called a preferred cognitive strategy. And it shows up in terms of the different professions and activities that men and women choose to do. The other thing that we know about the style of men and women is that we all have different styles of thinking. So I've already said that brains are different to start with. It turns out that 1 out of 3 women has some of the thinking style of a man, and 1 out of 3 men have some of the thinking styles of a woman, so there's some overlap there. But on top of that, the way that they think is also quite different for the most part. So each of us will have a style that we prefer, one or the other. Now, what we call left brain thinking has these properties. It's logical, sequential, and analytical. It takes a linear form of A to B to C. Before I believe B, I have to believe A. Before I believe C, I have to believe A and B together. As a consequence, the process is actually slower, but generally speaking, more accurate. And one way to actually tell that someone is what we call a left brainer is watch how they speak. And all you have to do is listen to someone who speaks very slowly, and chances are they're left brain. So you can see someone like Hillary Clinton and someone like Condoleezza Rice. When you watch how they speak, you know these are left brain females because they speak more slowly. So people that are left brain like lists, they like to have flow charts. They like to have everything on paper in front of them. You get the drift. Right brain is a different style of thinking. It's non-sequential and holistic with a seeing of patterns. It takes a long linear web form with creative leaps to the answer. So what you've got is like a spider web. And in this spider web, you go from A to D to G. Now, one of the consequences of that is it's very, very fast. But what happens if you miss a critical step and you're wrong? But the advantages of having what we call right brain thinking has to do with an effect that you see a bigger picture, you see the whole picture. You often have more than one solution to the problem, and you also have the ability to do what we call lateral leaps, where you can sort of make connections that you normally would not. So here's an example of my husband and myself. My husband, Serge, is the most left brain male I know, and one of the things that really would get to me is that he seems so slow, and that's because he takes his time, right? I'll never forget when I first discovered that a lot of times introverts, like my husband, will often finish their, what they're saying in their head, and they assume that they've told you. And I remember coming home and I said to my husband, Serge, I finally figured out you do answer me, after all. And he looks up from the couch and he says, I always answer you, but by the time I've said it, you've left the room. So it was a really good lesson on waiting. And so that's really important even for teachers with children that are introverts, is to wait until the answer comes back. All right? So take a look at this, and what you're going to witness is that as you look at the colors, now when you actually read the color it is, you can see your brain struggling between the left hemisphere and the right. Can you feel it? So that just tells you how remarkable the brain is and how those hemispheres interplay. Not only that, it turns out that overall, if you have what's called a left brain orientation, what tends to happen is that your decisions and your behaviors will show what's called a task and result orientation. That is to say, you like to have the facts and the evidence and all of those things, and you tend not to think about the people or the process as much. Right brain is a process and people orientation, and it's preferred by 2 out of 3 women. And processes people has to do with the fact that for those kind of individuals, relationships are really what's important. And again, if in fact that is your preference, your core beliefs, chances are going to be that people are more important than things. Do you see that? So what we do in our courses is we try and explore not only the thinking styles, but how your belief systems are set up. And one of the most fascinating areas that's just now I'm starting to do more work in, and I've picked up from the research, is the effect stress has not only on our thinking, but on our fears. And fears and beliefs are tied in together. So this is inaccurate. It's not true that the red picture is a female going to find a pair of pants. You're actually looking at a right-brainer who enjoys the process, right, as opposed to someone who's very task-oriented. And what you're really seeing here is that it turns out for married couples that are in business together, the best companies, small businesses, are where he or she is a left-brainer and the spouse is the opposite. It's like they balance each other and you have that difference that comes up to the front and actually has a benefit.